I've been noticing something very strange in AI discussions lately. Every week, there's another headline. The government wants more oversight. Someone wants fewer restrictions. A new model comes out. A lab releases something impressive. A politician says we're moving too fast. Another person says we're falling behind China. And everybody starts arguing. The thing is, the longer I watch these debates, the more I think most people are arguing about the wrong layer of the problem. It's a bit like arguing about a steam engine during the Industrial Revolution. You can't spend all day comparing steam engines. Which one is more efficient? Which country has more of them? Which company builds the best ones? But from the perspective of history, the important thing wasn't the steam engine. The important thing was that society was reorganizing itself around mechanical power. The machine was just the vehicle through which that happened. I have a growing suspicion that AI might be one of those things. Not because it's conscious, not because it's going to rise up and take over the world. Just because it might be the mechanism through which civilization reorganizes itself around a different resource. And that resource is cognition. Now, before anybody starts throwing tomatoes at their screen, let me explain what I mean. Because when I say cognition, I'm not talking about IQ. I'm not talking about intelligence as some measure of human worth. I'm talking about intelligence in the same way that we talk about electricity. Something that can be produced, distributed, amplified, and consumed. And increasingly controlled. The thought first started bothering me a couple years ago. At the time, I was mostly thinking about software development. I've been programming for a long time. Long enough that I've seen multiple waves of automation. Long enough that I've seen people predict the end of programmers about 50 times. Usually those predictions were nonsense. Tools got better, the programmers got more productive, life went on. But something feels different this time. Not because the models are perfect. They're obviously not. They hallucinate, they get confused, they make weird mistakes and stuff. Anybody using them seriously knows this. But I keep running into situations where one person can suddenly do things that previously required several people. Not perfectly, not always, but enough that the shape of the work starts changing. And once I noticed it in software, I started noticing it everywhere else. Design, research, writing, marketing, legal work, operations. The details are different, but the pattern feels similar. One person plus a collection of AI systems can command an amount of cognitive labor that would have seemed ridiculous not very long ago. And that is where the idea started forming. Because what exactly is happening there? Most people describe it as automation. I don't think that's quite right. What's actually being amplified isn't physical labor, it's thinking. Or at least some subset of thinking. Like reasoning, analysis, planning, research, drafting, or even exploration. The stuff that we usually associate with cognition. And that's where things get interesting. Because historically, societies tend to organize themselves around whatever resource becomes strategically important. Before, land mattered, then industry mattered, and then capital mattered, and then information mattered. And now I find myself wondering whether the cognition is becoming the next one. It's not intelligence as a trait, it's intelligence as an infrastructure. That's a very different statement. Information became infrastructure. Electricity became infrastructure. The internet became infrastructure. What happens if cognition becomes infrastructure? What happens when thinking itself becomes something that can be provisioned at scale? That's the question that keeps bouncing around in my head. And once you start looking at the world through that lens, a lot of recent events begin looking different. Take AI regulation. Most discussions frame it as a technology issue. But I don't think that's how governments are starting to see it. Increasingly, it feels like governments are looking at frontier AI the same way they look at strategic resources, like energy or defensive systems, for instance, or advanced semiconductors, infrastructure. Something important enough that you don't want to entirely leave it to chance. To me, that actually makes sense. If a technology genuinely amplifies cognitive capability, then of course governments are going to care about it. The part I find fascinating is that people often jump immediately to one of two conclusions. Either the government is going to regulate AI into oblivion, or the government is going to control all AI. Neither of those seems particularly plausible to me. The first one runs into economic reality, and the second one runs into reality itself. Knowledge spreads, ideas spread, and capabilities spread. Human beings have a remarkable track record of figuring those things out independently. And once something becomes sufficiently valuable, people generally keep pursuing it. What seems more likely is a messier outcome. Like there's different ecosystems, different centers of power, different approaches. There might be an American system, a Chinese system, a corporate system, or an open source system. Maybe entirely new systems we haven't even thought of yet. Not one giant AI empire, more like competing cognitive infrastructure. And that's where I started looking for a name for the larger pattern. The name I landed on is Neurocracy. I don't know if it's the perfect word. Maybe someone else will have a better one. But it captures something important. A neurocracy would be a society where cognition becomes the primary strategic resource. Not money or factories or land or natural resources or anything like that. Cognition. The ability to generate it, amplify it, and direct it. The ability to restrict it, to coordinate it, and to distribute it. Once you phrase it that way, a lot of things start looking different. Even education starts looking different. Historically, education was partly about transferring knowledge, but we're moving into a world where knowledge is increasingly abundant. The internet already did a lot of that. AI accelerates it. So what becomes valuable? Maybe judgment. It could be curiosity, goal formation, or just pure human will. Maybe understanding what questions to ask. Maybe it's the ability to direct enormous amounts of cognitive horsepower towards useful outcomes. Honestly, I'm not even really sure. But I suspect we're going to spend the next couple of decades figuring that out. It's another aspect of this that I don't think people talk about enough, is dependency. Because whenever a new technology arrives, there's a tendency to assume that more capability automatically means more empowerment. Sometimes that's true. Other times it is not. GPS is useful. Most of us also got worse at navigation. Search engines are useful, and most of us now memorize less information. Calculators are useful, and shit, I know myself that I got worse at doing arithmetic in my head. But none of these things are necessarily bad. They're trade-offs. But they're still trade-offs. So what happens when the thing being outsourced isn't arithmetic or navigation? What happens when it's larger chunks of cognition itself? I don't know. Anybody claiming to know with certainty is probably overconfident, or they're hyping you out. But I think it's a question worth asking, because there are at least two futures hiding in this idea. One of them is incredible, and everybody gains access to extraordinary cognitive leverage. Like a kid with a phone can do things that would have required an institution a generation earlier. Knowledge becomes more accessible, creativity explodes, everything accelerates. That's a real possibility. But the other possibility is that cognition becomes concentrated. The best systems become expensive. Access becomes restricted. A handful of organizations control a disproportionate amount of cognitive infrastructure. Most people don't own intelligence, they subscribe to it. That's a very different future. It's one that I call Neuro-Feudalism. Now, perhaps that's kind of a joke, but it really kind of fits the picture. Because the analogy is useful. A feudal peasant didn't own land. They depended on access to land. In a neuro-feudal world, people might depend on access to cognition. Again, I don't know if that's where we're going, but I think it's a possibility worth taking seriously. And maybe that's why I find current AI debates slightly frustrating. Everyone seems obsessed with the models, the benchmarks, the leaderboards, all the monthly drama. What's the latest release? Are we on, what version of Mythos are we on, or Fable, or whatever? But I have a feeling that future historians might look back on those arguments the same way we look back on arguments about individual steam engine designs. It's important at the time, but it's missing the larger shift. The larger shift might be that civilization is gradually learning how to manufacture cognition. If that's true, then we're still incredibly early. We're probably arguing about the equivalent of locomotives while industrial society itself is only just beginning to emerge. Maybe Neurocracy turns out to be a terrible name. Maybe the whole idea is wrong. Maybe we're seeing something completely different, but the pattern keeps showing up everywhere I look, and the more I think about it, the less I believe that AI is the story. I think cognition is the story. AI just happens to be the technology that's forcing us to notice it.